I'm here to talk about some of my recent research, which will hopefully kick off a good group conversation about the real-world implications of using an emergent technology in a sensitive social domain. And to help frame the research that I am going to describe, I'm going to talk about two concurrent phenomena that kind of led me to this research. And the first is that police departments, particularly in Western nations, have historically and currently engaged in discriminatory police practices. And when I say discriminatory police practices and policies, that can include using someone's perceived race, gender, or citizenship status as pretext for a stop, search, and arrest. It can include corruption, which is covering up when an officer is implicated in a crime or planting evidence on an innocent person, as well as this term called juking the stats, which can include both either increasing or decreasing individual and aggregate crime data. So if you wanted violent crime to appear as if it was going down, we've seen incidents of officers trying to convince a victim not to actually report a crime or actually downgrading the crime in the official records, while on the other side you can have police departments that will decrease the amount or increase the amount of property crimes that are in an official report to justify police presence in certain neighborhoods or the targeting of certain communities. And in the United States, these types of cases are investigated by the federal government, and they've also been, it's getting really loud with the they've also been challenged through what we called impact litigation in the United States. But even in those cases that I'm describing, they don't necessarily represent the totality of the problem for two distinct reasons. And one is that police departments maintain the pertinent information about their practices, which can sometimes make it hard to uncover the discriminatory nature of what's going on. And also these court-based solutions, such as government investigations or litigation, are both time and resource intensive, and they often focus on practices and procedures, so it leaves police data, which is often an artifact of the discriminatory practices and policies in place, which can lead to other problems. At the same time, police are increasingly turning to technology as an easy, quick fix to solutions rather than adopting wholesale systemic overhauls of problems. So in this slide, you can see a bunch of different surveillance technologies. Many are used to help investigate crimes. Some technologies are brought in as accountability measures. So in that middle image, you see a taser, and in the bottom, there's a body camera, both which were brought in at least in the United States, to address issues of overuse of violence and deaths by police. And then predictive policing, which is going to be the technology that I'm focusing on for the remainder of this talk. And there's two main types of predictive policing. The vertical image represents place-based predictive policing, which attempts to predict where a crime may occur in a given window of time. And this horizontal image is a visualization of person-based predictive policing, which attempts to predict who may be a victim or a perpetrator of a crime within a given window of time. And both of these systems rely on law enforcement data as well as non-law enforcement data, which may use where a metro stop is, where a pub or a liquor store is, and any other factors that a vendor thinks is relevant to predicting crime. And while these uses may seem fairly innocuous, it's really important to understand the data that's going into these systems as well as the context by which they're being used. So this is a cartoon, but dirty data is a term that we took from the data mining community, which can include missing data, wrong data, or misrepresentations of the same data in a data set. And here, and in the law review, where if you want to hear more about what this talk is about, and I recommend you read, we extend this term to include the production of data within policing. And this is important because at least in the United States, there are no national, state, or local standards for how police data is collected or used. So this means that the data often reflects the environment and policy priorities of the police departments and the communities in which they're used. And to give some examples of what I actually mean when I'm talking about dirty data and policing, this can include aggregate crime data on stop searches and arrests of innocent people, which misrepresents the prevalence of crime in certain communities. data that reflects falsified records or planted evidence, as I referenced before. Skewed data of calls for service for crimes that aren't actually crimes, and I'll explain that a little bit more because I don't know if that's purely a US issue at this moment. Systemic manipulation, so the juking the stats issue that I described before, as well as errors in recording, so that could mean putting in the wrong number or misspellings. And it's important to note that data can also be subject to multiple forms of manipulation at the same time, which can make it difficult, if not impossible, to separate the good data from the dirty data. And this is notable, and what's on this slide is excerpts from 2 of the prominent US predictive policing companies, because these companies and others have suggested that you cannot easily isolate or mitigate this dirty data problem through classical mathematical, technological, or statistical techniques. And the concern with dirty data is what's known as the bias in, bias out phenomena, or feedback loops, and that's where a predictive system will send police to the same neighborhoods or same areas despite the actual crime rate. And one thing, oh, never mind. And so it's the combination of these issues that actually brought me to my research, which I'll give you a brief overview of and then kind of do the major observations for others to comment from. So this map is a representation of the 13 jurisdictions that I focused on, and the jurisdictions that I focused on had to meet these 2 specific criteria. The first is that they are using, have previously used, or are developing a predictive policing system while being subject to a government investigation or some other type of federally court adjudicated settlement that showed that these police departments participated in discriminatory conduct and practices. And then I compared the data from these police departments with data about the actual systems that were used to assess the level of risk that these predictive systems were predicting or projecting predictions that were based on the embedded bias in the data. And this is what it showed. So 9 jurisdictions implemented predictive policing systems that used data during the periods that the police participated in discriminatory police practices and policies. And what this meant is that there was a high risk that the predictions of these systems reflected the bias embedded in the data. So it projected the bias that the police practices reflected. And here I've highlighted one example, and if you do look at the law review, it's a full chart of every jurisdiction and what we found. But here I highlighted Chicago because there they used a person-based predictive policing system that tried to identify individuals that would either be a perpetrator or a victim of a shooting-related crime. And what we found is that a significant portion of the individuals labeled on this list had never actually had involvement with the police, committed a crime, or been involved in a shooting, and that the majority of the list was predominantly dominated by young black men, which is the same demographic that was disproportionately targeted by the Chicago police for over 50 years, including incidents of torture. And the other 4 jurisdictions were inconclusive due to a lack of public information about their predictive policing systems or public information about pertinent government policies like data sharing between departments within overlapping jurisdictions. And here I've highlighted Maricopa County, which is in Arizona, and you may have heard of their top official, Sheriff Arpaio, who was pardoned by our President Trump last year, and their department had several officials who were held in contempt of court for constantly violating court orders that mandated that they stop trying to enforce immigration policies, which is a legally gray area in the United States, as well as discriminatory practices that predominantly affected Latino and Black members of their community. And the reason why this jurisdiction was inconclusive is because of 2 issues. First, the county sheriff's department was also performing police duties for towns and cities within the area. So some towns and cities didn't have enough resources for their own police department, so they were both serving that double function. And there were at least 4 towns and cities that were using predictive policing within Maricopa County, but the problem is that they didn't have clear public records about data sharing between these problem departments. So you had some data that suggested that there was data sharing and others that weren't as clear, but no official policy, which made it hard for us to assess the level of risk that the dirty data from the Sheriff's County Department was affecting the predictions within the areas within the county. Oh, wow. So this is very large. So earlier I mentioned the bias in, bias out phenomena, also known as feedback loops, and there's been some research that looked at the mathematical models of these predictive policing systems and have found that they have what are called runaway feedback loops, which means that police are being sent back to the same neighborhoods regardless of the actual crime occurrence rate. And what this research shows is that feedback loops are also attributed to the police departments as well as societal implications. So first, I think it's important for us to understand the problems with police data. And the first problem, which you can't really see, but I'll just tell you what these are saying, is that police data often reflects the practice, policies, and agendas of police departments rather than the actual occurrence of prevalence or occurrence rates of crime. And the second important point is that the police data may omit certain information that is not captured by police practices based on their views of certain types of crimes and certain types of criminals. So one specific way to understand this is that most predictive policing systems and most police departments in the United States primarily focus on violent and property and other street crimes. But when you actually look at the crime prevalence rates in the United States, white-collar crime, which is both underreported and underinvestigated by police departments, occurs at a rate that's almost three times the amount of all of those other crime categories combined, which really shows you a sort of asymmetry in policy priorities. And I focus on these problems because police data, when you look at the confluence of both of these issues, both the omission of certain crimes and types of criminals, as well as misrepresentations of what's actually happening with crime, you end up with a database justification for increased policing and surveillance of certain historically over-policed communities, as well as reinforcing popular misconceptions regarding the criminality and safety of certain types of communities and certain types of criminals. And if you are interested in this type of tension, there is great research that you can look up by the White Collar Crimes Risk Zones, which did a satirical representation of applying a predictive policing system to white-collar crimes. And surprise, surprise, it was primarily in the Wall Street area of New York City. And these broader societal implications is why the feedback loop is so pernicious. When we observe police presence in contacting certain marginalized communities, it can reinforce unwarranted assumptions and stereotypes. And if there's continued exposure over time without a counter narrative, it can allow society to maintain prejudice against certain marginalized groups while maintaining explicit commitments to egalitarian principles. And these complex yet contradictory sentiments can incite a response that further perpetuates the feedback loop. So if you observe racially biased policing, it can reinforce racially biased animus or false stereotypes about criminality of certain groups, which can then lead to improper calls for service for non-criminal activity. And this is highlighted in two ways. So on the left-hand side, you see a bunch of photos which are actually just internet memes of a problem that's been pretty persistent in the United States of white people calling the police on black people for non-criminal activities such as barbecuing in a park or not waving hi to your neighbor. And the image on the right is of recent research that looked at New York City 311 data. So that's where you call to report a crime or for some type of law enforcement involvement in the United States. And there they found that in neighborhoods that experienced recent gentrification, so the influx of more white and affluent residents, not only did the calls for service go up by 3 times, but most of the incidents ended in summons or arrest, or the likelihood of it ending in summons or arrest were much more likely in those neighborhoods when compared to other neighborhoods that did not have those types of changes. And the reason why these societal implications are really important is because they give more opportunities for police to use discretion or selective enforcement, which can further distort the data. And feedback loops can also influence public policy by driving a database justification for austerity measures and policies that attempt to micromanage populations that are misperceived as causing or increasing disorder or causing public safety issues. And specifically what I focused on with this point was looking at what are called nuisance laws in the United States, and they empower the government to penalize individuals or community for what is considered nuisance conduct, which is an ill-defined category that can range from littering all the way to assault, depending on the jurisdiction. And a recent ACLU report that looked at the application of nuisance crimes found that the policies disproportionately affect poor communities of color because they amplify the harms of the criminal justice system and exacerbate socioeconomic and racial inequalities by making housing instability a consequence of law enforcement. And since I've been, okay, that doesn't look good either. So I'll end with a few other highlights from the research, and I encourage you to just read the report if you want to learn a little bit more or even get citations to some of the points that I referenced. But the first that you can't see is that there are a few political and institutional incentives that encourage self-monitoring and auditing. And because most reforms focus on the actual practices rather than the underlying data, there needs to be a shift in looking at data collection practices as well as organization and use practices by police departments if we want to address these problems that I've described today. But one uplifting, or maybe that's a little too encouraging, but one positive shift that has happened since this law review was published is that the LAPD Inspector General, which is the oversight authority over the police there, recently did a review of their data-driven practices, and they found most of the things that I've described today to be true, but they also raised questions about the overall efficacy of these data-driven practices because they didn't really see a difference in the crime rates or in public safety in those areas. And they also raised concerns about implementation issues because even though officers were explicitly told not to use the fact that someone was on a list as pretext for a stop, they found that officers still arrested and stopped people, which is a constitutional violation. The second is that there needs to be restrictions, prohibitions, or complete overhauls of dirty data. And this is because these issues, even though I focus specifically on policing, are not contained to policing. At least in the United States, police data is used at all other decision points throughout the criminal justice system, so that can include pretrial services, your housing allocation when you're in prison, all the way to corrections, as well as non-criminal justice uses such as education, child welfare, or homeless services. So it's important to also look at the extent of the reach of this data when looking at the problems of the underlying dirty data. And then finally, there needs to be an empowered and independent authority to assess and address dirty data issues. And this is where I end on a very depressing note, because unfortunately in the United States, when the former Attorney General Jeff Sessions left office, he made several policy changes which resulted in limiting the use of these consent decrees, which means that many of the jurisdictions that I focused on likely wouldn't be subject to any type of reform under these new policies. But though I have focused a lot on critiquing dirty data, I don't want to make it seem like data in itself is a problem. In fact, data is very important for governance and policy-making decisions because in its absence, there's going to be too much reliance on subjective things like using your gut or intuition. But also it helps us understand the full scope of these problems. And in fact, in some of the jurisdictions, once the public was allowed to have access to the data, it did reaffirm a lot of the calls that the community were making about the discriminatory practices of the police. But it's also important to understand that data is not apolitical or ahistorical, and it's very important to understand the context in which it is collected and then subsequently used, because if we don't interrogate data and how it's used, then we're bound to see that bias can corrupt even some of the most noble cases. And so I will stop there and get under a blanket.
Please. Hi. Thank you, Rashida. Her ankles. Please, round of applause. Not the ankles alone, you understand.
Yeah.
My name is Sarah, I'm with Omidyar Network, and we are talking about dirty data and bad decisions. And next up, we have Marc Warner.
Cool.
So I was hoping to talk a little bit about what you do in the circumstance where your algorithms could in fact be biased, could be unfair. In some sense, we could just decide to ban all predictive analytics, but probably, in some particular cases, maybe the ones Rashida was talking about, it might be so egregious that the failures might be so egregious that we do something like that. But if we decide not to ban it in all circumstances, how can we do it well? So I'm from a company called Faculty. I'm the CEO and co-founder, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about how one might tackle this problem in the real world. So we're a data science machine learning company, and so we have to deploy algorithms on a regular basis. And we like the analogy of technologies developing like humans, so starting in their infancy, going into their adolescence, and finally into adulthood. You can think of the internet starting in the 70s and 80s as all kinds of possibility, and then perhaps the sort of 20 years of the dot-com boom, and then the recent troubles being the adolescence. And over the next few years, we're going to have to see it mature into a sort of sensible adult. And artificial intelligence is going to be something similar. We are going to see that in the early phases, there's a lot of ferment, a lot of uncertainty about how to do it well, but eventually it will mature into a field where we understand these things and can do it properly. So our mission is to make artificial intelligence real, to use it to enhance products, build better services, and save lives. And we've been privileged enough to work with over 300 companies on 5 different continents in 23 sectors. And by making artificial intelligence real, what we really mean is take it out of the lab and into production. So, we've worked with places like the London Fire Brigade to help them figure out how to do target inspections more efficiently, or the Home Office to help stop terrorist videos from spreading online. And we think that this making artificial intelligence real contains absolutely fundamentally making it safe at the same time. Those should not be two distinct things. As you may, if you want to hear more about this, you should go and hear Stuart Russell's talk tomorrow. He's a famous professor in artificial intelligence, and he will tell you that no one thinks about making a bridge first and then making it safe afterwards. Making it safe is just inherently contained in the definition of building a bridge. And so we believe that artificial intelligence should be made safe from the foundations. But that's easier said than done. Like, a lot of people talk about that, but actually making it happen is kind of cutting-edge research at the moment. And so we divide it into 3 separate categories: fairness, robustness, and explainability. So fairness is, does it do the right thing? Robustness is, even in the circumstances of the real world, will it continue those behaviors? And finally, explainability, can humans actually understand why it's making the decisions that it is? So let's take the example of something like car insurance. If you decide to use an algorithm to choose who you're going to insure for a car, you might start by being very sensible and saying, well, I'm not going to use any protected characteristics like gender or ethnicity in my algorithm. But you might think that something like geography, like where people are, is an important determinant of how likely the car is to get stolen. But of course, especially in London, that is extremely correlated with ethnicity, and so you're effectively building that into your algorithm without even noticing it. And that, of course, is a huge problem. And so we've actually built the algorithms to detect that kind of bias, even under the circumstances where it's just correlated to a variable, and eliminate it. And so we have this tooling that is now available to data scientists to actually take their black box algorithm, so it doesn't even matter what type of algorithm you're using, and understand exactly why it's making the decisions that it is. And the nice thing is that because this is built into a workbench, it makes it very easy for data scientists to do this as they're going, as they're developing their tools. You can sort of think of it as like a debug mode for AI. I mean, one of the sort of interesting things that we found in doing this is that these calculations are extremely hard. So we use basically the biggest servers available on AWS to just run a single explainability calculation in the background for data scientists. We think this is basically one of the reasons why it's just not that widespread right now. So of course, the ultimate solution is going to involve multiple factors. Certainly policy and regulation, a kind of top-down approach. Certainly education and professional standards, a bottom-up approach. But with both of those, we have to make it as easy as possible for data scientists. This is not going to work if they can't just run this on a sort of day-to-day level. And so hopefully we have built and will be publishing some of the tools that data scientists can use to make their algorithms fair, robust, and explainable. Thank you very much.
And next up is Markou.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to get my excuses out of the way up front. I am Christopher Markou. I am a Leverhulme Fellow and lecturer at the University of Cambridge Faculty of Law and at the School of Law here in King's College London, where I teach a course called AI Law and Society. If you can't tell, this lovely weather has turned what began with hay fever into a full-blown cold. So I'm 2 Benadryl in right now. So anything that I say that might come across incorrectly, I'm just going to have to play the academic freedom card. I want to respond to Rashida's paper and pull out a couple things, because I think it speaks to, well, what interested me to do a PhD in AI and law in the first place and what I spend most of my time on now. And when we talk about predictive policing, what we're really talking about is a wider sort of phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that Frank Pasquale, in a book that might be familiar to most of you, called The Black Box Society, has explained. And he says that authority in society, regardless of what kind of authority, legal authority, political authority, economic authority, is increasingly expressed algorithmically. And this is a seemingly sort of obvious statement now. We are so accustomed to algorithmic systems being embedded in our world and our lives, in consequential contexts that make decisions, financial, economic, about opportunities we have. But over the last few years, as this sort of AI enterprise has really taken on a sort of new life of its own, what's really started to sort of frustrate me as a lawyer first and social scientist second is that a lot of the enthusiasm about the opportunities of AI have really sort of, in my opinion, kind of led us to be sort of myopic about what it means for authority in society to not just be expressed algorithmically, but through the language of computation. Now, computation is a language much like the natural languages we use and speak to each other with, but not all languages are created equally. And in a society that is already replete with inequalities and inequities, what I think we risk doing with this enthusiasm to use AI, this tech solutionism to believe that AI is a universal solvent to all complex societal or socio-technical problems, is I really think we risk doing, well, what might be potentially irreversible, particularly in law. And the phenomenon that I'm really, really interested in is one that is perhaps best exemplified by French legal scholar Alain Suppiot. He wrote a book a couple years ago called Governance by Numbers. If you haven't read it, I do recommend it. But its thesis is actually pretty straightforward, but I think it's a very important one. He observes over the last 10 to 15 years the sort of gradual erosion of constitutional and legal authority in society for the replacement by sort of quantitative metrics. And he says that this sort of machinic and computational logic has begun to colonize how we think and interact with the world to such an extent that what we usually come to think of as law, this system of norms and ideas that we have fought long and hard for, is really starting to ebb away now and be replaced by a new form of authority, which is quantitative metrics. Now, I fully understand that we are at CogX, and there are a lot of people here who have a lot invested in quantitative metrics and a lot of optimism for what those metrics might let us do. But the concern that I have, certainly if you've paid attention to the news in the last few years, is that we've seen what's happened in the US with the election. We've seen what's happened with Brexit. We have seen the erosion of the media system, the collapse of political consensus, and the inability now to perhaps agree upon the existence of an objective reality where we can come together as a people and make decisions. My concern is that as we start using these quantitative metrics in law and law enforcement, which is exactly what predictive policing is, I think we risk applying machinic logic to human affairs and allowing one of the last remaining core systems of our world to kind of be colonized by a logic that might not, a logic and a language that might not be able to express and encapsulate all of the values in law that we struggle to define and explain, things like fairness and justice and equality, but also things like reasonableness and equity. So the concern that I have, and that I spend most of my time trying to think about now, is the extent to which all of these deeply embedded norms that are structurally integral to our society, what do we lose when we try to capture these and express them, or assume that they can be expressed by computation? I don't have a good answer to that yet. I'll get back to you when I finish, and today's probably not the right day to ask me, but what I do think, and I'm very conscious that we are on an ethics stage, this is probably the wrong place to say it, but I'll take my last minute to make a provocation. As a lawyer, it is my sincere hope that perhaps in a year from now, the entire AI ethics enterprise will collapse under the weight of its own hubris, and we won't have to do this again. I'll pick up what my friend Johnny Penn said and said, maybe we should be talking about the AI justice stage, because what I think we've allowed to happen is that we've allowed ethics to become a proxy for law and public policy and allow the private sector to begin defining the normative core of our society and our world. And quite frankly, as a lawyer and someone who is genuinely concerned about the welfare of the people around him and wanting to make sure this whole thing doesn't come collapsing down on us, is I really, really hope that we can begin to shift this conversation back into the realm of law, justice, policy, and not allowing, I'm going to get in trouble for this one, philosophers to dictate what should be in our world, because I think they've had a go of it now for a while, and I think all we've really ended up with is the co-opting of what should be the single most important social institution we have, which is our justice system, and allow these normative questions to be resolved by the best intentions of people who, well, perhaps might not be representative or connected to the people who are actually affected by the worst manifestations of what this technology does. So I'll leave it there, but thank you very much.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about training lawyers, judges, and others to sort of navigate these justice systems that are increasingly sort of run by data-driven tools. And when I talk to lawyers about technology, I usually start with a story about Helen of Troy, the cause of the Trojan War. Homer writes, the most beautiful woman in the world. Marlowe has a great line that hers was the face that launched 1,000 ships, which I always thought was curious. Ancient Greece famously didn't have cameras. And so most of the men on those ships, men who were going to die, didn't really have any idea what Helen looked like. Not that they would say that if you asked them. They'd say, oh, no, she's the most beautiful person in the world, obviously. Next question. But if you started probing at that clear mental image that they had in their mind and started asking, well, what is her face shaped like? Is it sort of oval or heart-shaped? What about her nose? Does it go down or does it tip up at the end? What about her eyebrows or her earlobes? Are they attached or detached? The more questions you start asking, the more details you start probing at, this clear picture they have in their head, it's going to start to look just a bit blurrier. And it's not their fault, right? Like us as humans, our brains are very good at coming up with mental models and sort of simple structures to explain the world. We're also good at pretending that these models are sort of sufficient and complete, and we're not as good at figuring out when these models are deficient and may cause us harm. And you see this sort of in the modern study of crime, right? There's this need, there's this urge to build models, and there's a tension between that need to build models and the sort of continuing revelations that these models are almost always deficient in some way. So until the 1940s, for instance, crime was generally accepted to be a symptom of poverty. The reason why, as Rashida touched on, is that these studies of crime ignored white-collar and corporate criminal behavior. And the difference there isn't in any sort of inherent property of criminal behavior, but merely in the administrative tools that were used to prosecute one crime or another. And so these administrative choices, these institutions that we create, can also sort of influence the tools that institutions use. So closer to what Rashida was talking about, the history of place-based policing goes back actually about a century. And again, it only focuses on certain types of crime. In the US, the city of Baltimore famously would take wall-sized printouts of the city and hand annotate them, and then reprint them when something changes as a way to track crime. So in other words, there's some institutional theory of change that even if we take these tools away, there's some change that is going to motivate the creation and acquisition of predictive policing tools like the ones that we're talking about. And those underlying institutional theories of change can also mean that the same policy, the same tool, can have unpredictable effects across different institutions. In the United States, when mandatory minimum prison sentences were lifted, jurisdictions actually ended up with divergent incarceration rates. As sociologist Mona Lynch noted, the jurisdictions don't resemble each other after the reforms, but they do resemble themselves. So we have this need to sort of build structures and models to make sense of the world. And we have trouble sort of recognizing when these structures and models are deficient and that those deficiencies can have consequences. So how do you train lawyers to deal with that, right? How can we help lawyers and law students and judges to sort of continue to consider the structure of the thing that they're interacting with? At a class at Georgetown Law, my teaching partner and I have tried to use simulations. So we built this simulation, Detain Release, to teach students about the use of risk assessments in pretrial detention decisions. So here, students play the role of a judge, and they're prompted to make decisions about whether to detain defendants before trial or release them on their own recognizance. And so a defendant here has a name, a charge, a story, a prosecutor recommendation, and a risk assessment. And we procedurally generate these defendants from national arrest statistics and census data. So no two runs of the simulation are the same, and students don't quite know what's coming next as they try to balance a crowding jail with public fear that spikes when a released defendant commits a crime or shows up in court. But this isn't quite enough. So when we teach a simulation in class, we have students run it multiple times, alone and then in groups. And we track their decision-making live. And we intersperse these runs with sort of mini lectures about risk assessment in student-led discussions. And after a run or two, we prompt students to sort of reflect on the decisions that they're making, right? And the decision-making systems that they're building on top of these tools. And some of those systems make sense, right? If a defendant has a high risk of violence, they're probably getting detained. Others, maybe less so. We had one group that after one too many violations decided that they were going to jail any female forger they happened to see. So after a few more runs, students get really into this. Right? They get invested in the defendants they see. They get disappointed when a defendant they release comes back. And so on the one hand, it's good that students are sort of independently interested in this lesson, but our work isn't quite done, right? So at the end, we show them this. It's a list of consequences. You made the choice to detain people. As a result of the detention, the people that you detained are more likely to plea out. The people who go to trial are more likely to be convicted because being in jail while you're awaiting trial inhibits your defense. Once they're released, they're likely to face housing consequences. They're going to have trouble keeping jobs. They're going to have trouble keeping their families together. And that notion closes the loop, right? It prompts students to then start to unpack the risk assessment. What does high risk really mean in this context? Where does this data come from? Is it any good? Is it relevant to the jurisdiction that we're talking about? And what does it mean that we've built an entire system of thinking on top of a tool and an interface that we don't completely understand? And so that's the provocation that I want to add here, right? That data-driven tools frame decision-making in ways that may be difficult to predict as they mix with different interfaces, different administrative processes, different institutional and human models for thinking about the world. And so when we're deployed somewhere like criminal justice, everyone has a heightened obligation to both sort of better understand these models and to recognize when the models that they built may no longer be up to the task. Thanks very much.
Fascinating, thank you. So I think we only have about 10 minutes for our panel, and I'm going to hand over to the audience. I want to pick up on a couple of threads that I heard that I thought were really interesting. This piece that you said, Christopher, around the visible, much publicized decline of trust in institutions, in societies, in governments, And I want to note that that's only for certain communities, that marginalized people are far more likely to have less trust to start with. And this kind of invisible sleepwalk towards trust in algorithms instead, trust in data, trust in tech. And I'm not sure if this is the right question, but how do we put the kind of genie back in the box? If we think about the fact that these products are being used in police forces across the world, how do we think about responsible purchasing power to start with? Like, how do we think about that? You know, it's not just about the kind of algorithmic auditing and standards, but how do we think about educating those that are using the tools as well? And I'm curious to get Rashida's thoughts on this, given your research.
I think we need to fundamentally rethink everything. And
Everything.
no, because like the thing is, I'm not up here as a Luddite that doesn't believe in technology, and that's why I end after like talking for 20 minutes about how bad data is with like recognizing that it does have value. I think it presents an opportunity for us to address a lot of structural and systemic problems we have in society that we choose to avoid. So I generally come from the viewpoint that none of these tools are going to work in the criminal justice system because it's broken. So if you're just putting Band-Aid solutions on top of a fundamentally dysfunctional system, you're not even the best working model or machine learning system is still going to produce bias and unjust outcomes because it's based on this underlying system. And I also think where you see the deployment of these tools shows a sort of asymmetry in political agendas, in that I didn't get into this in the presentation, but we don't even have a full head count on the amount of predictive policing systems that have been or are currently being used in the United States. But currently, there's only one pilot study that's looking at a known problem in policing in the US, and that's police misconduct. And it's a pilot that's not even done, and it's only in 3 jurisdictions. And the fact that we have hundreds of years of documented problems of misconduct in policing, and we know that's a known problem that data could actually help us address, there's only one pilot study, whereas we have all of these use cases that are used on some type of flawed pathology that we have about criminal justice that are being applied at a rate we don't even understand. And I think that shows you sort of where the priorities are, and that's why I think a lot of us have these great concerns, is because it's like none of this is new, but it does provide an opportunity to sort of shift the way we look at these issues. So I guess the hope is that we change the conversation from how can we use data to help solve public safety and whatever identified problem has been made by politicians. Instead, how can we use data to understand the problems that we know exist, to understand policy interventions that should be in place to help address those problems, or figure out just a completely new way to think about public safety, education, or whatever the social issue is.
So maybe this is just the Canadian in me saying this, but I mean, the reasons as to why the US justice system is as broken as it is are several and complex, to say the least. But if we were to parse out, one major contributor, perhaps, it was arbitrarily setting goals and working towards them. The war on drugs is perhaps one of the best exemplars of this. I think that if you want to not worsen the problem with the justice system, you have to have a little bit of clear-sightedness as to what you're working towards, what you're optimizing towards. What is success with predictive policing? Is it a world of no crime? Is it presumably less crime? Is it efficiency? Is it to me, there's always been a sort of lack of accounting. The predictive policing is one example, but robot judges, quote unquote, is the other example. To me, this seems like problematizing something, proffering the solution, and saying, this will fix it, without any sort of clear understanding of what you're fixing, why, or how this thing will help you do it.
But presumably, so I totally agree that this stuff done badly is very bad. But if you take the examples you were talking about around these terrible discriminatory police, I forget exactly, Chicago, right? And you say that gets you dirty data, which is obviously bad to put into an algorithm. So you remove the algorithm, but you're still left with a terrible discriminatory police force. And I guess there is, and I guess maybe this is what you're advocating for, is in some sense we should change that. But to me, that seems like we've been trying that for many, many decades, if not centuries.
I would disagree that we're trying at all.
Okay. Well, there are at least
And that's the other layer, right? Is ultimately this comes back to politics and the short-term versus long-term view of how we kind of want the world to look. And I think in the current US system, and the current UK system, you could argue that the current governments do not seem to have this piece around justice at the forefront of their minds.
So accepting that, then how do you make a small intervention? Like, if given that reality, conditioned on that, you're stuck with that, and you have only a very small set of tools that allows you to make a difference. And perhaps there's a route. So I totally agree. Badly built algorithms, terrible, and can make the problem worse. But perhaps this is a vision for the future where you can actually make a difference with a relatively small thing, because you could imagine, in principle at least, taking the decision out of the hands of these terribly biased, discriminatory police forces. And this does offer a route that is somewhat different to what we've tried for the last 100 years and basically failed at consistently.
That's a good question. Are there, and I maybe I'm naive here, are there positive examples of technology that has worked, even in the social justice space that you guys have seen?
I was going to, Keith kept looking like he wanted to talk, so I'll let-
All right, I'll do that one, and then I'll do the positive thing first, and then the negative thing. So I think the positive thing, so I think a couple of examples that are starting to come up are the use of risk assessments not to make detention decisions, but to make sort of positive, like, social intervention questions. So like, one of the issues even with deploying like a risk assessment tool is that at the end of the day, if the judge still only has two options, which is detain somebody or give them bail or release them, it still sort of handcuffs the judge, right? So I think creating opportunities to match people who are in the criminal justice system with alternatives to punishment and detention is maybe a path forward. But that having been said, I think to your point, like, to me, the sort of read I have of Rashida's paper is that it's a little bit like saying, gosh, this aspirin that I'm taking isn't helping my case of plague, right? And like the solution isn't then like, I will just need to take this other aspirin later, right, or take more aspirin. It's like there needs to be sort of a fundamental policy change. And I think the lesson that we get from criminal justice is that sort of no matter the tools or the policies of the institutions that are sort of mapped onto onto a police force or onto a court, we have to account for the fact that there is this sort of inbuilt model of thinking, this inbuilt way of thinking, and sort of dealing with how somebody like Chicago Police Department is going to manipulate whatever tool they have for their own ends.
And I think that gets back to some of the points that Christopher was making about authority from the beginning, because even with some of the intervention models that are starting to come up, I'm always hesitant to be that optimistic about them, because we live in a society that's fairly punitive, and often with a few cases of intervention models where social services are applied to an individual rather than being detained, they're often implemented in a way that's dehumanizing, so it may have requirements that are setting people up to fail. So you have to go to 7 meetings at all types of hours in a week, and if you have a low-income job and no job flexibility, there's no way you're going to meet those sort of interventions, so then you're being set up to be sent back to jail. And I think that this approach can be useful if we actually try to take a more holistic and humanizing approach.
So there was something in your paper that I thought was really appropriate, and that's the use of the concept of feedback loops, because feedback loops feature in another very important AI-adjacent field, which is cybernetics. And perhaps a better name for what we now refer to as AI would be just cybernetics 2.0. And without going through the history of this, if you set yourself the goal of believing that computation or data is this sort of ontologically superior mechanism for intervening in your society, how you set up the structural determinants of that society within that circuit, within that feedback loop, will ensure that you are only ultimately repeating the same processes over and over and over again. The technology might get better and the circuit might get quicker, but structurally things don't change unless you have the courage to actually change the structural foundations of the system that you set up in the first place.
But hang on, but all of these things are just, so what you said there is equivalently applicable to our existing systems. In fact, I wasn't sure whether you were actually describing our existing system. We certainly have these feedback loops right now.
Sure.
There's certainly nothing that we can imagine doing about them to change them easily, because they're basically conditioned into human behavior. So that is, you gave the perfect argument for why a technological intervention gives you the only hope of fixing it.
Do you want to take that one?
I guess I'm just confused as to why you think technological solutions are the only solution, because I think in a lot
I don't
of
think they're the only solution. I think a behavior change solution offers a sort of decades-long track, and we should pursue that additionally. But there's a possibility to do something faster and cleaner.
Could you
But
point to an example where
Yeah.
that's worked?
Where technology has improved something.
You know what I
that's quite
mean?
a-
Where it's
generic.
achieved the narrow goal of facilitating behavioral change that we wouldn't consider to be insidious or just outrightly creepy.
So you're looking, for example, of a circumstance where a technology makes a deciin.
I'm looking
that
for an
makes-
example of what you were just claiming, yes.
I mean, you can compare, so take Tetlock's view on expert political judgment. I mean, it's quite clear that algorithms often outpredict humans, particularly in
Is
complicated
there a real-world
geopolitical-
use case that you could point to where this is actually consequential?
I would say that I do think. I'm just thinking, there are very clear uses where algorithms give efficiency and utility. I take your point around social justice. I think, are you particularly focusing on the social justice aspect?
I think that within the justice system, efficiency is a very, very weird
Dangerous
word,
thing. Yeah.
dangerous word.
Fair.
That optimizing for efficiency in the justice system is terrifying. That's never been the overriding priority, at least not when I went to law school. But okay.
I was trying to pass out technology as a general thing versus technology in this particular space. Just if I was trying to.
No, I mean, I agree that, but again, an optimizing for an efficiency can be done by a human system or an algorithmic system, and I think your point holds equally to both. Like, it is not at all clear what efficiency means in that circumstance, and it probably means something bad for the people inside this that get trapped in the system.
I think maybe to close the loop on the question that you had started with, and maybe even to not continue to throw you under the bus and be responsible for algorithmic
We like
justice.
controversy here, don't we? Come on, this is.
Yeah,
let's be
okay,
fun
fine. All right,
conversation.
well, then we'll get the bus later. But I think that in terms of a short-term intervention that I think would be really meaningful, right, is that these tools are sort of procured through traditional procurement processes that, at least in the United States, tend to be cloaked in secrecy. And the sort of, I think, feedback loop that is nascent but still very worrying is this idea that it is okay to have these decision-making systems that are not transparent and
I don't
not
wanna
accessible.
defend these decision-making
But that's my sort of point of going into what is the short-term slightly better version or slightly less dystopic version of this. There is yes, there's an argument. There's a case to be made for behavior change, for policy change. I think there's also a short-term argument that we need to find ways to destroy the business models of sort of companies that are pitching to the criminal justice system based on kind of secret programs and secret algorithms. And so that may be that we're using something that's more transparent and not as good, but
There's a case to be made that no public sector algorithmic system should be anything other than open source and reviewable in the first place. I mean, this probably should be off limits to the private sector, but I'm just old-fashioned like that, I guess.
But I guess I'm really interested in your point around building up the courage. I think there's been all kinds of examples in the last couple of months around Palantir and a lot of their work that is deeply creepy, even for someone like me who's quite technical, optimistic by nature. How should we build up the courage? And I want to hand over to the audience after this. I want to kind of, I know that a few of us on the panel are more optimistic than negative around this area, but obviously I have less knowledge in the space. How do we as a society build up the courage and make change? And I want to start with you, Rashida.
I guess I'm going to ask for clarity. Make change through.
If we look at the entire system around social justice and policing, if we take policing as one particular example, how do we build that courage and really address what is a very long history of social bias, injustice, inequality, oppression? That seems huge to me. How do we
I think we need to take them on, because I think thinking of these issues as too big to do anything about is why we're in a position where we have oppressive systems that, well, like the U.S. system, we have the largest amount of people in prison in the world, and you don't get there through just having a population of just bad people. Those are all policy decisions. So I think we just need to take these types of discussions head on. A lot of them lead back to how do we look at poverty and broader social issues, and I think there's a lot of non-technical fixes that requires us to be honest about political decisions that are being made, who's making those decisions, whose business interests are benefiting from those decisions, and either owning, hey, we want to make money off the fact that people are going to prison, or talk honestly as a society of, if we want a safe community and we want everyone to have equal opportunities to education, social services, and anything else, what does it require for us to do that? And what is hindering us from making those decisions? And it's like, those are difficult questions, but if we don't have the conversation, then I think we're just going to continue with the status quo, which is bleak, but that's where we are.
Marc.
So I mean, I really like the idea of making sort of algorithms that are making these kind of choices open source, transparent, so that they do get exposed to the best criticism out there. I don't think there's any rationale. I mean, I actually agree with Rashida on the, like, my knowledge of, I mean, mainly from reading your work, but my knowledge of the algorithms that are being used, they're just terrible. Like, obviously completely flawed and just shouldn't be in use.
Well, the trouble with Compass, in the U.S. at least, is that they quickly retreated behind trade secret protection,
Exactly.
which
Right.
made
Terrible.
the entire, exhibit A of terrible decision-making in the justice system. I mean,
But I think the Law Society report that came out last week said the same in the UK. That I think it was Liberty who FOI'd, and were not able to find out who was using what algorithms. So it's a global problem, I think, the black box.
And I think to your simulations argument, like, if you do present it as a black box, people do end up like naturally trusting it too much and not digging into it. But I do think that there's this glimmer of hope that, yes, all of that is terribly flawed, and yes, it should just be immediately abandoned. But that doesn't mean that there's no hope of fixing it with these kind of technologies done right.
Well, and I think
Sorry, we only have a couple of minutes left.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Is that okay? I think that, to your point, the way to sort of make changes we need to sort of train advocates and lawyers to sort of better understand these tools and how they interact with the justice system. Because at least in the U.S. and in common law systems, like, lawyers are meant to be kind of the immune system, right? The only way that these things change is by cases being brought and by people fighting it, and that requires people to actually have an understanding of what the heck is going on behind these tools.
I'll just say, just really quickly, my friend Julia Powles wrote something really, really good with Helen Nissenbaum on this, and I think that it is perhaps the most obvious way to answer this question. Not to poo-poo ethics more than I already have, but I think that the conversation has been defined and success has been defined as resolving narrow computational puzzles, and once we do so, the idea is okay. And I think this is detracted from what they say is far more fundamental questions about what we should be building in the first place.
Can I say one more? I also think we need to broaden who's in these conversations, because often it's tech people talking about the algorithms and then lawyers talking about legal frameworks, and then no one talking to people who are actually affected by the systems or have views on the broader social issues. So that.
So I'm really sorry, we've run over slightly. We only have time for 2 questions from the audience. Oh,
No questions.
no questions. Okay, I'm so sorry. I think we are doing Meet the Speakers, though. Sorry.
Thank you for bearing with us in the cold.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.